Good afternoon and welcome. Welcome to Let's Talk. Welcome to another Wednesday live lunchtime chat with myself, Jonathan, and the lovely Lara up in Scotland. How are you today?
I'm great, thank you, actually. It's not raining today.
Is it not? Well done.
No, I know. So I'm actually really quite happy about that. I've been up bright and early this morning, got loads of work done, feel good. What about you?
Yeah, not too bad. In fact, I think we had the rain last night down south. It was lovely, beautiful sunshine for quite a few days, almost 30 degrees again, and then we had the rain last night. So it must have drifted down.
Oh, that's better. You need a bit of rain. Oh, God, you need a bit of rain. We've got Lorna Scullion has joined us so far, which is great. Good afternoon, Lorna. I hope that you're really well.
So today, everyone, we are talking poltergeists. We are going to be talking about how they are formed, whether you have one. So if you have any suspicion that you might have a poltergeist in your house, or if you want to know how you might think that you've got a poltergeist in your house, get in contact. Make your comments known in the comments below in either any of the feeds, or send us a message. Or if you want to come online and chat to us, you can appear in the middle between us that way. You can appear between us. Come and speak to us. We can share the link and you can come and chat to us. So we would love to have a conversation with you. In fact, I'm going to share the link right now. So if you follow that link, you will be backstage in the studio, and then we can pop you up live and we can have a conversation with you. So we hope to be joined by Alan Murdie, who's rather an expert in poltergeist, who has been studying. You can't get on.
I know it's all going there. Alan can't get on apparently, but he can call in. All right, if that's any good. The message just came up in the group there, so I think they can call in. Hello, Sheena Aspinall. Hello, we've got Stephen Branch. Good afternoon, Stephen. Claire Davey, Mary Heaven, and we've got Philip Asada and Michelle Kidd. We've got a full house in here today.
Oh, a lot of people saying hello. So guys, come on. If you have any examples or any case studies, if you know of anyone, any friends who think they may have had a poltergeist in their house, or whether you might think one, let us know. We'd love to chat to you. And now we should be talking about the Battersea Poltergeist case. Now, lots of you will probably have heard of the Enfield Poltergeist case. It was a particularly famous one. It then appeared in The Conjuring 2, when the Warrens originally had Conjuring 1 in America, and then they came over to look at the Enfield Poltergeist case, and then the film was based about the story of the Enfield Poltergeist. But there was also a Battersea. What's fascinating about this case is that not only did it start just as a very innocuous little case, it's what we probably all encountered in one way or another. The fact that you will probably find a pair of keys or an object which you're not quite sure where it came from, you find it, you're not quite sure where, or sometimes you've got the more mischievous ones who have obviously hidden something. We've all lost things, and then suddenly they turn up in the most random of places. Well, what happened in the Battersea case was that it was a series of appearances, apports as they're sometimes referred to, of objects appearing that they didn't actually belong to them, but they didn't know where they were coming from. In this case, it actually appeared on the lady's bed, so it was really definitive. When a key appeared, it didn't actually fit a house on her bed. It was almost invading her personal space. And then it progressed on, and it became a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more angry, a little bit noisy, these knocks and sounds occurring all the time. It got worse and worse and worse. What is interesting is that this whole case carried on, and it's probably the most enduring ghost stories and enduring poltergeist activities, because it went on to actually form a form of communication for about at least 20 years, where this ghost constantly was in a form of communication. And I don't want to spoil it, just in case we get Alan on, but that's who we wanted to talk to about exploring the case.
I didn't see what Amanda's put up in the comments. Amanda Fearley, look at that, where the grandmother used to, and I'm thinking, right, I'm going to message Nori. Perhaps Alan could call you on the phone and you could put him on loudspeaker and everybody could hear him.
We could try, yes.
Okay, right. You just talk amongst yourselves, guys. I'm just going to go in.
What I'm going to do is we have, so the time when the original poltergeist case happened, it did reach the news and it became quite newsworthy. So what I can do is just show you an example of one that happened in the Rhondda Valley as opposed to Battersea, to show you the kind of atmosphere that where the Battersea story originally occurred.
Do you believe in ghosts? No? Well, perhaps not. But then, a week ago, neither did the Howells family, who lived in this house here in Rhondda Street in Swansea. I say lived because so many strange and unexplained things have been happening in the house since Monday that the Howells have been forced to leave. The Howells, Marcia, aged 20, her 25-year-old husband David, and their 2 young children are convinced that the house has been invaded by a poltergeist. Mrs. Howells describes what happened on Monday afternoon.
Well, it was about 5 o'clock in the evening, and I just poured my little girl a cup of tea in my mother's room. I went out the back kitchen, and as I opened the door, this bottle came flying towards me. And of course, I shut the door to protect myself. I opened it again, and I seen this other bottle. So I just picked up the children, and I ran out the house. As I ran out, my husband was coming down the street here, and he ran straight in the house, and by the time he got in there, all the place was turned upside down.
What sort of state was the kitchen?
It was terrible. The couch, the TV, everything just thrown in the middle of the room.
Yes.
But nothing happened on Tuesday. But yesterday, it was about 3 o'clock, and I left my mother and the baby in the front room while I went up to school for my little girl. When I came home, my mother was on the doorstep. I asked her what was the matter, and she said that she heard this noise and she couldn't get out the back kitchen because the door was jammed. She could just poke her head in, and seen that it had happened the same as it did on Monday. So with that, I went in the room, I pushed the door open, moved the couch. I looked out the back kitchen, nothing was touched out there. I went upstairs, and when I got upstairs, the bedroom was all upside down. My little boy's cot was underneath the bed. If he'd been in it, he would have been killed. And I went clean down then, and we came out there and waited for my husband. When my husband came home, before my husband came home, we heard this other noise, but we didn't go in. Then my husband went in, we had a look, and everything in the back kitchen, my stove, everything was chucked about, on the floor.
What was the state of the bedroom?
The bedroom it was a terrible state. Everything, my towel boy, the bed, the cots, everything turned upside down. And well, even the police, they had to break into the bedroom before they got there.
You called in the police. What did they say?
Well, they haven't got any explanation for it at all, because as I said, it couldn't be nothing human, because how could it get out of the front bedroom down to the kitchen when the police had to break in?
Now, you've moved out of the house for the time being. Will you be moving back?
I'm never going to move back. Never.
Well, what do you think? The police who were called to the house admit that they are completely baffled. And certainly it was no figment of imagination that threw the bottles around the room and turned the bedroom and kitchen into a complete shambles. The question that the neighbours around here are asking now is, could this happen to them?
So there you go. That was an interesting case. That was a particularly violent case of paranormal activity in the question of, in fact, it being, it was quite a violent case of paranormal activity in terms of poltergeist. Now, what do we mean by poltergeist? We effectively mean angry or noisy spirit. And in fact, they have been around for a very long time, poltergeists. In fact, Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, but Martin Luther, the great philosopher and the starter of the Lutheran religion, was apparently a victim of poltergeist activity back in 1600s. So the idea of a poltergeist is certainly not a new one, not a 20th century. But there was that time about the 1950s, 1960s, when suddenly the Enfield poltergeist, that Rhondda one, the Battersea poltergeist, became quite, I don't say fashionable, that's a wrong expression, but suddenly it all started coming in. Now, we've had quite a few comments, haven't we, from people commenting about the fact that they can remember from their childhood poltergeist activity. So, for example, we've had Amanda say, my nan had poltergeist. She used to leave buttons and magazines out for it to play with. She would come down in the morning to find them arranged in circles or stacked up. Well, it's quite nice that you're giving them something to play with, but I don't know if it's necessarily the best strategy. Michelle is asking, can negative spirits come and go, or can they have specific times of year that they play up more? Lara, that's a definite question for you.
Well, they can have specific times of the year where they play up more because it's to do with what they remember, right? So this is the key, right? So if that time of the year appertains to what they remember, and it prompts, a bit like, I suppose, you get people on this side of life, right, in physicality, that they can start to then become not well, perhaps mentally not cope as well. So because they tie a memory in with that, with maybe a traumatic event, right? So they can play up if there's been a traumatic event, which quite often would be on the other side if there wasn't a traumatic event, when you think about it, because they've passed, haven't they? So that trauma is trapped, basically. That trauma is trapped energy in there. And of course, if you're undergoing stress yourself, made changes, significant changes that are quite dramatic, teenagers as well, because they give off a lot of random energy too, then it can quite often align with the vibration of the poltergeist. And of course, it draws energy from that, doesn't it?
Mm. Now, I think we might be joined by Alan. Let's have a go. Alan, can you hear us? Hello? Alan?
Alan.
I feel like I'm doing a Eurovision Song Contest.
That's right. No point.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, Alan, we can hear you. Yes.
You can hear me. Oh, good.
We can hear you now, yes.
Oh, well, you're spared seeing me at the moment, but we'll see what we can do. There. Hello to you both, and apologies for the...
No, thank you so much for joining us. We're honoured.
Oh, well, that's very touching. Yeah, I'll see what we can do about the image in due course. But anyway, at least we can speak, and you're able to hear me, which is marvellous.
Fantastic. So, Alan, we have outlaid the basics of what poltergeist is. We've spoken a little bit about the Battersea the Battersea case and other cases like the Enfield. And lots of people have been commenting about experiences they've had with potential poltergeist activity. So do you want to say how you got involved with the Battersea case?
Yes, certainly. I can describe my knowledge. It first came to my awareness a very long time ago, during the 1970s, when I first became interested in the paranormal. And the book I first learnt about it was a book written by the late Andrew Green, who for some 60 years was a ghost hunter in England. He began his ghost hunting career in 1944. His first ghost hunt was almost his last, when he entered a haunted property in Ealing, now demolished, and went into a strange kind of trance where he nearly jumped off the roof. And he wouldn't have been the first, according to the reputation. It was a house known as the House of Suicides. Well, this didn't actually put him off ghost hunting. He was pulled back in the nick of time by his father, but it set him off on a career which carried on until his death in 2004. He published, after some 30 odd years or so, published a book called Our Haunted Kingdom, looking at some 300 ghosts around the UK and a smattering of poltergeist cases. And one he included was the by then forgotten Battersea case. In 1956-57, he'd been approached by the News Chronicle newspaper to investigate this haunted house in Battersea, which was hitting the headlines. And Andrew maintained he went into the house, met 15-year-old Shirley Hitchens, who appeared to be the focus of it, and heard strange knocking sounds and footsteps in the property, which he couldn't explain. And he was convinced that there were genuine phenomena going on in the house. However, what made him markedly sceptical was when the following week he got a letter from the poltergeist, written in a mixture of English and very bad French, handwritten letter from the poltergeist. It was followed by a further 8 letters and a Christmas card. And at that point, he concluded that there were hoaxing elements in it. Rather charitably, he came to the conclusion that perhaps Shirley herself had gone into some kind of or autonomic state, some kind of trance. She'd engaged perhaps in automatic writing, and this had led her to produce these letters. He cross-examined her and asked her the obvious question when she said that she insisted that the poltergeist was the one writing the letters. He maintained, he then asked her about how the poltergeist then got the letters into an envelope, and how the envelope then got stamped and addressed, and how it ended up being put in the post, to which he maintained answer came there none. So he concluded it was a hoax, and that's more or less where the matter rested, right until 2014. Just a little bit before, the James Clark, who'd been writing about ghosts of London, got in touch with me after I'd published a copy of the photograph of one of the letters, which appeared in Andrew's 1973 Our Haunted Kingdom. And I by that stage, I was looking after the rights of Andrew Green's widows as to using the photo. And I said, by all means, publish it, use what you can. This is what I know. He then tracked down Shirley Hitchens, by then a lady in her 70s, and discovered there was an awful lot more to this Battersea poltergeist. It culminated in a meeting of the London Fortean Society in spring 2014 in London. James didn't particularly want to give a talk on it, but he spent 3 years working with Shirley Hitchens producing the Poltergeist Prince of London, and discovered there was an awful lot more to this story. But I was then asked if I might come along and give a talk. Well, I said, I spoke to Shirley Hitchens herself about it, and she didn't want to give a kind of talk or lecture, but she did agree to having an interview, a sort of interview on stage in front of everyone, and I was happy to ask her some questions and so forth. And as a result of that meeting and that encounter, I began to realise there was a lot more to the story of the Battersea poltergeist than I'd been led to believe simply from dear old Andrew Green.
So, Alan, I'll let you carry on because it was fascinating, but I've got to stop you before we carry on, because
please do.
The minute you went from poltergeists under the classic classification of noisy spirits and objects moving and sounds to writing letters is quite a jump.
It is indeed, isn't it? As I think Lara may have been saying on the issue of poltergeists, quite often they're associated with adolescence, with teenagers passing through puberty. I mean, that was more or less the model that most people accepted for well into the mid 20th century. Either these girls were hoaxing it, or they sort of halfway houses, they were going into trance conditions and producing it, or that there were genuine phenomena associated with them. More recently, it's come to be recognised that it isn't just simply a problem of adolescence, but we also have the problem of haunted premises, which seem to have persistent poltergeist phenomena. We hear these a lot in cases of haunted pubs, for instance, where year in, year out, odd physical events occur, but there is no obvious focus because the personnel, the people in the living in the pub change over the years. But jumping to letter writing, well, that did seem to be a new one. I mean, there was many years before you'll all heard of the Borley Rectory case, I'm sure. There were allegations of wall writing there, but the general view was that had been done by the wife of one of the rectors, Marianne Foister. So it was something of certainly of an oddity, to say the least.
So what happened next? How did it progress?
Well, I got the opportunity to actually meet Shirley Hitchens face to face, because I'd only ever read about the case and how it was ascribed to a dead teenage prince, the son of Louis XVI, who disappeared. Historically, he's known he disappeared in the Bastille and is assumed to have been murdered. And there was over 100 books written during the 19th and 20th centuries about the true identity and whereabouts of the missing heir to the throne. Well, here he was, good 150 years later, supposedly showing up in suburban Battersea in a working class home. So I asked Shirley the obvious question to begin with. I said, in front of the audience there, I said, well, it's a very interesting story, and I'd explained what I'd learned from Andrew Green and his take on it, and I said, well, I'm sure there's one question here the audience would all like to know the answer. And having, it went on for a lot longer, as James and your book says. What was it like living with a dead teenage French prince? And I shall always remember her reply. She said it was terrifying. And at that point, it began to become clear to me that whatever had gone on in that case, in this story, was a lot more complicated than the received version that I'd read in Our Haunted Kingdom years before, and which I'd heard Andrew Green talk about, because his knowledge ceased of the case in 1957. He just ascribed it as some genuine phenomena, and thereafter, well, letters and Christmas cards, being written. I then talked at greater length with Shirley, and she produced some of the letters. And in fact, she produced a selection of about 100. And this really did pique my interest, because, this was, even if we assume the whole thing is a complete fraud, which is, of course, one thing, it is interesting in terms of psychic hoaxing and frauds and so forth. Little did I know, she then gave me the opportunity. She said a lot of the records and notes have survived, because it turned out Andrew Green wasn't the key investigator, as James Clark revives from rescues from history. Most of the work was undertaken by an altogether now forgotten investigator at the time called Harold Chibbett. Now, Harold Chibbett was a tax inspector by day and a ghost hunter and ufologist by night.
Wow.
I feel a bit for Harold Chibbett, because one of my subjects as a lawyer is I do an awful lot of local taxation and council tax, so I have a kind of fellow feeling with him. But if you do something like taxation law, you can frankly you do need some light relief for the mind. But Harold was a fascinating figure who investigated Shirley's case really from start to finish. He first read about it in the press. He turned up on the door, and in 1956, and managed to persuade them of his bona fides. He then spent working on this case until 1972. So this was a second feature which makes this case remarkable. It's a long-running one. Most ones involving teenagers, adolescents, are over usually within about 6 months. Here was one that appeared to go on from 1956 for 12 years until 1968. And it involved the production of not hundreds, but in fact thousands of alleged letters, and also wrapped out seance communications. And these had all been preserved. A few, Shirley hadn't preserved them. They'd actually been saved by Harold Chibbett himself. And he had died, sadly, in February 1978, whereupon his executor had contacted Shirley and her family. She was now grown up. She was Shirley Hanlon, of course, married to a husband of many years, Derek, and he said, "Do you want these records all about you?" So Shirley, sort of not really knowing what to do with them, said yes. It had been a big part of her life, and she took them, and then they just really sat in the attic for the next over 30 years until James Clark managed to trace her and got in touch. Since then, I've had the opportunity to inspect a lot of these letters and records. Very significantly, there's also hundreds of pages of an ongoing diary or ledger, which Harold Chibbett compiled almost as a nightly service for many months, over many years, and also his own records of trying to trace Donald the Poltergeist in the archives in France. And you can imagine this was all pre-internet. This was all, before the World Wide Web. He went to extraordinary lengths trying to trace through official channels, the French government, Versailles Palace, various repositories and archives, trying to find some corroboration in the material, all the time accumulating more and more of these letters. So it's a fascinating piece of, even if it's a complete hoax, it's a fascinating case in the sheer volume of material being produced, and also in terms of the length of duration. Interestingly, Shirley actually moves out of the house when she gets married in 1965. By that stage, she's met Derek, her husband, whom she's still married to. I've spoken with Derek. He said he saw odd things, including, not just written letters, but also black slogans and words daubed on the walls and ceilings of the property on some of his visits. He didn't deter his romance, but he came back and married Shirley. She moved out. The letters still continue for another 3 years. So by that stage, there's only her mother and her father left in the house. So we in terms of finding an obvious culprit, if we take a skeptical approach, there's problems with Shirley in that respect.
So where does it stand now?
Well, that's a very good question. Trying to make sense of thousands of pages of material, which is what it amounts to, sheets, written notes, some of them are written on cardboard. Best we would say is this is a case which is not, it's hard to fit into any paradigm at all. It's hard to come up with one conclusive catch-all explanation on this. Personally, I maintain a boggle factor. I find it hard to believe in a letter-writing poltergeist, and I think probably the next stage would be: is it some kind of mediumistic trance? If so, by whom? In the course of this, I found out more about the Hitchens family, including that Shirley had a brother, an adopted brother, who was in the house, who gets limited mention in the book. He didn't really want to cooperate with it. By this stage, he actually moved to Australia in the late 1950s and didn't really want to be mixed up with his background in Battersea. Initially, when I heard that, I thought, well, was this a case of an aggrieved adoptive sibling faking and hoaxing material? He was an intelligent man. He was training to be an architect in later life, except of course he moves out in 1957 and is in Australia, so everything that follows can't be pinned to him. There was a grandmother living with them. She can't be her. She dies in 1957. I don't believe it was her father, Wally, because Wally actually leaves 5 years worth of daily diaries. Wally was a tube driver when he wasn't having to deal with the poltergeist problem at home and look after his wife, Shirley's mother, who was effectively an invalid. So it might have been, and apparently had difficulty writing anything. So we're left with a limited range of suspects. I don't think it was Harold Shibbert behind this. Never rule out the possibility an investigator may be acting fraudulently. As I said, I find it hard to believe in letter-writing poltergeists. However, one has to follow where the evidence lies. Plenty of witnesses did exist to say there were genuine phenomena going on in the property. Shirley was not actually caught faking anything. So this case remains as an enigma. Interestingly, when one starts to look into the historical records, it turns out not to be as unique as it first appears. Scattered through the literature of poltergeists, we find cases of writing alleged letters and messages written or scrawled by poltergeists over the years. The other thing which it does remind me of, because this is not the only area of psychical research where you end up with a vast amount of written documentation. If we look at some of the outpourings of trance mediums, automatists, mediums who go into trance and specialize in written messages, again, we're faced with, in a sense, a similar problem. There's been numerous cases over the last 100 years or more of mediums producing lengthy seance or trance scripts, often handwritten. Most famous one was, or the one who's hardest to explain, is Mrs. Piper, an American medium for many years, never caught in any fakery or fraud. She could go into trance and write with both hands simultaneously, and although there was a fair amount of nonsense, incoherent stuff that was meaningless, she also produced what many researchers found was significant information she could not have obtained in a channel, nor through normal channels. Another was the wife of the poet W.B. Yeats, who, after her marriage to him in 1918, she was a much younger wife, developed her mediumistic scripts. She produced something like 3,500 pages of documentations. There was Mrs. Geraldine Cummins, who produced whole books with the researcher Frederick Bly Bond, which purported to come from dead monks at Glastonbury and characters in the New Testament. And this is the problem. There is too much information. I haven't even touched on the classic cross correspondences, which was a collection of mediums in the United Kingdom, in the United States and India at the beginning of the 20th century, who produced scripts over many, many years and this wasn't sort of, I have a message for Smith, or, Tiddles the cat is doing well in the afterlife. This was material which was, you need to have a fairly good grasp of Latin, Greek, the classics, literature, and French to really appreciate the artistic and literary and philological context of this material, which didn't seem to make any sense on its own, but when actually combined together, various people who've looked at it, the small number, it must be said, because it really needs teams of scholars to understand it all, have said that there is some kind of code which may suggest an overall control or some kind of discarnate survival. Here we're looking at letters produced at 63 Wycliffe Road, a terraced house in Battersea, in a working class district for 12 years. We are faced with a similar riddle or enigma.
Can I just clarify? One of the things I wanted to was picking up is so you've got this written material in all these cases. Are some of those cases the person in question has written them themselves, and supposedly channeled, but we're saying definitely in the Battersea case that these letters turned up and nobody's claiming that they wrote them.
Well, it's certainly the case that everyone involved seems to have blamed Donald the poltergeist for writing them. That, of course, doesn't necessarily rule out human causation. It's like the arguments about who wrote Shakespeare. Ultimately, perhaps we will never know. I mean, was it somebody called Shakespeare or William Shakespeare, or was it somebody with the same name who was different? This is a great historical literary conundrum which has gone on for generations and is repeated many times, with people coming up with who wrote this, that, or the other conspiracy theories long after the event. Did Mary Shelley write Frankenstein, or was it her husband Percy Bysshe Shelley? All you can do is look at the material. You can't ever be certain, and try and reach some possible conclusions. Unfortunately, with the paranormal, we're all, it must be said, whoever we are, groping our way, really.
But just to clarify, then, some of those other cases you referenced, when you said they produced written material, were they actually...
They were holding the pen. Yeah.
Yes. So that was
in some seances, people have claimed apports of written messages. In some poltergeist cases, I'm thinking here of the Nova Scotia Esther Cox case, 1879, an invisible hand was said to have written upon the wall, "Esther Cox, you are mine to kill." And rather upsetting Esther, who was the focus of the case, to say the least. So there are claims of it. Most of the mediums, who've produced this stuff will say, we go into trance, I don't know what I'm writing, my hand just writes automatically. When this was looked at in the High Court in 1927 in a copyright dispute between Geraldine Cummins and Frederick Bligh Bond over who owned the copyright in the script, Mr. Justice Eve concluded his jurisdiction didn't run beyond the grave, and said the copyright had to rest with the lady who held the pen, even though she said it was a spirit doing it. She claimed she was not responsible, but as far as the law could settle anything, it had to conclude that she owned the copyright. She'd been holding the pen. Frederick Bligh Bond also insisted he was he was not prompting it. It was the spirits. That's as far as you can get, really, in terms of objectively deciding this.
Since we've got a lawyer on, is that actually now still the case law for copyright beyond the grave?
It does remain the case, yes. Yeah, it remains good law today.
I wonder whether that was involved in it at all with the monkey that did the selfie. I wonder if they could try and pull that into.
Well, yes, this is a problem that pops up with computer-generated works increasingly now. With who is actually, this becomes quite alarming when you look at the possibilities for artificial intelligence. There's previously been arguments about copyright in a set of somebody rather cruelly dipped the webbed feet of a duck into some paint and made it walk across canvas. And there was an argument some 20 years ago about whose copyright was this? Could it vest in the duck? Unfortunately, the duck is not a legal person for the purposes of the 1988 copyright legislation.
How backward they were.
Yes.
Stephen has asked an interesting question. He says, has the handwriting ever been studied? Any graphologists looked at it at all? Not to my knowledge. This is an interesting area which could be pursued. Certainly, would be to do that, and also to look at surviving samples of handwriting of members of the household. That would be the challenge. Yes, that
would be the challenge. Again, could one? How far one can go depends on the expertise of a graphologist concerned. This is a contentious thing which occurs in legal proceedings. Ultimately, your scientific expert or a graphologist in this case can only give you a probability I mean, basically, courtrooms are different places to laboratories. You prove things to a certain standard in courtrooms, which is not a scientific standard. The law doesn't care whether scientific theories are true or false. All it can say is that, this is on the, there is a probability here. You can't do tests in that sense in a courtroom setting. In a laboratory, again, there are limits to what you can prove in a laboratory. You can prove things to a repeat standard, but there are many things you can't prove on a scientific basis. And I'm thinking here of, this is why we have courts equally, to sort out a case of, for example, issue of child abuse. If a child is injured, you can confirm that that child has been injured. There will be medical traces. What you can't do is determine whether it's an accident or whether a parent or a brother or sister was responsible. You need to look at other evidence. Now, a lot of scientists aren't very happy with that as some kind of argument. That it's the best system we've got for finding out the truth. I always make the point to a scientist, if you had an accusation of scientific fraud, that a scientist was faking laboratory tests, you could not simply prove that on an empirical basis. You could not take two sets of results and say one is fraudulent, one is not, purely on itself. You would need other evidence to see whether fraud has taken place.
Alan, I didn't get a chance to introduce you at the beginning, which is a little bit rude of me. But how did you get it so involved with the paranormal community? So I could say that you're currently the chair, is that right, of the Ghost Club?
That's right, yes.
And a council member on the SPR?
The Society for Psychical Research.
So how does a lawyer we've now found out corporate taxation, or at least council tax taxation, have such a fascination with the paranormal?
Well, there's more interesting things than law, aren't there? Let's be real about it. Ultimately, the paranormal is something interesting, mysterious, and stimulating. The law can be that as well, but ultimately, the law doesn't deal with ultimate questions which affect each and every one of us, whether we want to face them or not.
So that's quite a very legalistic answer. But what was the process? I mean, what did you, a lot of people say when they got into ghost hunting, it's because they had an experience. They got an experience that enlightened them and got that interest. Was there something similar for you?
No, there was no real experience for me early on. I was very interested. If I hadn't gone into law, I think I'd have gone into science. I was very interested in science when I was younger, and I was interested in the boundaries of science. And I think what can happen, either people are interested in the subject, before adolescence, and it stays with them, or they become interested in their teenage years and it stays with them, or it can be a result of some kind of experience, as you say, that leads them into it. With me, I was always, had a lot of curiosity about that, but not just the paranormal and so forth. Lots of other subjects are very interesting as well.
And so in terms of the Battersea case, what is next? What needs to be done next? Is it on hold? Is it still ongoing? Do you need a graphologist?
Well, I think that the opportunity is there to develop with the materials. Currently, everything's on hold with the surely, like so many people over 70, is having to quarantine, and that's. But we're thinking certainly of preserving this material. Is ultimately one of the important things that psychical researchers can do. In a way, I sometimes think that this is a mistake of many ghost hunters and researchers, is that we don't actually look at what has been accumulated. People are forever running off to the next exciting case, and finding new haunts and so on. But that's to shut our eyes to the volumes of things that have been accumulated and are in need of of assessment and study. I mean, it's taken well over 30 years to get anyone to properly start looking at the Enfield Poltergeist recordings.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, I used to ask both the late Maurice Gross and the late Guy Playfair, both of whom I knew very well for many years. I would ask them, you've been subject to a lot of criticism from people who weren't there. Have any of them actually come to ask to actually examine your raw data, your footage, your material, the stuff you have talked about? And there was far more to the Enfield case than has ever been published. I mean, when you look back at what the researchers were doing with very limited support at the time, they did an incredible amount. Practically, Maurice Gross was almost moving into the house at various stages. There's hundreds of hours of material and hundreds of pages and recorded. Far more evidence than you have in most vast majority of murder cases, for instance. There is just the problem is the bulk of testimony. But when it's come to analysing it, people have come forward with I wouldn't even say half-baked theories about what could have happened there, but none of them have actually, which is what I attempt to do. I've learned, through legal practice, you have to go back to the original records, the original witnesses. That was actually done in 1982 as regards the witnesses by something called the Enfield Poltergeist Investigation Committee, which comprised of rather sceptical members of the Society for Psychical Research. They went back, re-interviewed the witnesses, published a 200-page report on this, which is like concluding, yes, genuine psychokinetic events occurred in the house, was their tentative conclusion on the end of it. And then after that, really very little at all. No one went back to either Maurice or to Guy asking to see or study the original data. It's almost like there's a deliberate reluctance to do it. More recently, by virtue of him being archivist, Dr. Melvin Willin of the SPR has gone back to the materials from 2009 onwards. Now, I remember Melvin was sceptical on it, and he said, I was sceptical on the Enfield case. Now, having examined it, I don't think it's a case of tomfoolery and faking.
Oh, well.
And he's published a 180-page book called The Enfield Tapes with just some of the edited highlights.
Well, interesting. Yeah. We just had Amanda Fernley just say the book The Enfield Poltergeist Tapes is a fascinating read. So yeah, I think she was...
Well, it's one that scratches the surface. And this is the problem also with the Battersea case, is there is just too much material.
So, I mean, are there any plans either with SPR or the Ghost Club of sort of setting up a committee or a working group to plow through this?
Not at present. It is the problem. Is the problem with spontaneous case research? Unfortunately, I've come to realise is it tends to be the province of individual researchers over the years who work on cases and then in the natural course of things themselves they die, leaving no obvious successors, and then another generation comes along to try and make sense of it. I mean, I think the overall problem is one of institutional reluctance. I mean, this is not just the only area of social life. There's all kinds of social problems that don't get the attention that they need. It's a lack of resources and a lack of investment. Yeah.
And I'm guessing that the vast paranormal community that very often want to go and investigate a haunted manor house or a castle, or go looking for UFOs, very often don't want to go through the dusty archives and actually do that legwork to actually then look at all this amount of data recorded.
Well, I suppose that's very true. It doesn't have to give you the exciting frisson of sitting in the dark and waiting for a ghost to come and breathe on you or interfere with you or whatever. No. I mean, it depends what interests people, but it's not not a thrilling task.
So I think if nothing else, we need to put a request out for archivists. Probably the most unsexy thing you could possibly ask for, but we need people that are prepared to do that legwork, to go through this vast quantity of data that's out there of fascinating cases like this.
Yeah, I mean, in theory, analysis should become easier with computerization and artificial intelligence and so forth. You can study things in a way that the cross correspondences I mentioned, the book subject of a book by Trevor Hamilton, who applied a computer analysis to some of the material and found that he thought there were significant patterns in it. I mean, the other problem that we have is we haven't got an overall theory on understanding this thing. There's lots of theories, lots of views, and I never discourage anyone from putting forward their ideas or theories, but this was a point the late Maurice Grosse always used to say. He said, I'm not really interested in theories. There's been loads of theories. None of them actually fit the complexities of what we're facing. That's the thing. It's when you're dealing with infinities and all kinds of unanswered questions. After all, we don't even understand great many what we call natural or normal processes. We don't know how the brain works. We don't know how the mind works. We do not know the limits of physics, despite the assured materialism of many scientists and cultural historians and so forth, who take a purely materialistic view. I'm afraid life is and the universe is far more complex than that.
Can I just point out that there's actually documentation and lots of it. The fact that there's documentation exists means that we can't all be wrong.
Well, I agree with that, Laura. Absolutely. I used to be very sceptical of one-off poltergeists myself. Mm-hmm. Then, back in 1997, doing a bit of investigation in Latin America, I was in Bogota, and I thought, well, the word poltergeist doesn't exist in Latin American Spanish. In Colombia, they call it something else, it turns out, call them duende. I thought there's nothing known in the English-speaking world about Colombian poltergeists. Let's go and have a look in the great big National Library. So I started looking and requesting books there, and I know enough basic sort of Spanish to do research. And lo and behold, I found a case of a stone-throwing poltergeist from 1837 in a town I'd never heard of called Popayan. And it was about a family who were bombarded with stones. Initially, they were arrested at one point. Then the police had to release them because the stone throwing continued. And it ended up with, it ended up with a bit of a tragedy, with the mother dying at the end of it. And there were names and there were dates and so forth. And on one level, this case was unremarkable. It could be duplicated with hundreds of examples around the world of stone-throwing poltergeists, invisible assailants who can't be found, and so forth. And that was what struck me as significant. It was just like all the others. And here it was, buried in a 1951 book called Mitos de Antioquia, Myths of Antioquia, except it had names, dates, and was clearly referenced and based on an actual event. And in terms of a test for proof, well, this is a legal perspective. Quite often with some of the most serious crimes, I'm thinking, of serial homicides and serial sex offenders, there may be no witness, or there may just be one witness. Now, who may be, not believed or discredited, what you have to do is you have to take a kind of jigsaw approach. And when you start to find striking similarities between witnesses many years, many miles apart, I mean, it's a horrible area, but the people who've been victims of serial sexual offenders who've abused people over many years, when you get different stories from individuals who've suffered the abuse, telling basically the same sort of story, many years, many miles apart. Well, those can all be added together and they become proof. Most murderers, there aren't any witnesses, but you can find enough pieces of evidence which it becomes impossible to the standard beyond reasonable doubt to explain as anything other than a deliberate act of murder. And if we apply that same test known as the similar fact evidence, which convicts people throughout the English-speaking world in the courts, both used in North America and Commonwealth countries, then we have the same degree of evidence, in my view, as we find in poltergeist cases and quite a few other psychic happenings and events.
Fascinating. I've got to say, I want to go back to that part, right, where listening to my instinct kind of like jumped up a little bit is we're talking about Shirley and all that, the poltergeist posting the letters and stuff, and I was like, oh my God, actually post the letters. But the one place that my mind stopped on, was it the brother that was looking after the mother-in-law?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Now, it sounds like a guy under pressure, and people do things weirdly under pressure. You need to understand about how human beings work, and we've all got a pressure point, and we tend to, people can do things at that point they're not actually aware of doing. Now, for some reason, I would want to look into that. So is there the letters, did they carry on after the brother? Is the brother still here, or is he passed, or?
The brother died about 5 years ago, about 2015. He was 82. He actually, the letters carried on after he left the property in 1957. He as I said, he moved to Australia.
Right. So they post to somebody to send in the UK. I take it was a UK postmark.
Well, what Shirley explained, she explained how did they get in the post, because Andrew Green was not the only person who got some of the letters. So did Tommy Steele, apparently, at one point, and one or two other people who were actors and celebrities. And they appeared up quite a few places. What Shirley and how she explains this is that she was quite open about it. She said it was myself and my parents who put the letters in the post. The letters were produced in a room which Harold Chibbett sealed off, and letters would appear there, was what they claimed, and we were instructed to post them to whoever the letter was addressed to. If we didn't, Donald would start lighting fires in the house.
So how would Donald instruct them to do it? Did he leave a note, or did he talk to them? Or
he would leave notes, and he would rap out communications. And there were a lot of attempts at seances where raps were recorded, spelling out letters of the alphabet and so forth.
As a medium, the more you interact with them, the more they're encouraged as well. The more they get practice, the more they will up the ante as well. I'm impressed with that, Alan.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, Laura. The more you, that is a danger in some of these cases. If you give it a personality, it can act up for it. I mean, I think that's a valid point.
That's right. So, assuming, right, that they pass over, they need practice at doing things because they haven't got a body anymore, have they? So they're given tests by this side, and so they're going to strive to achieve that. Before you know it, they've got this personality, and they're asking you to post letters for them, right?
Yeah.
Incredible. I'm impressed with that. I've got to say, really impressed.
I mean, whatever was going on, they weren't afraid of the law either, because they got some hate mail, which definitely came from local people. They called in the police. The police were called out to fires. At one point, Shirley, there was an amazing incident fairly early on, where Shirley went round to the house of some spiritualists. It was a friend of Walter, her father, had a train driver friend who was a spiritualist, and they were holding a seance and to try and contact Donald, to try and put the spirit to rest. And lo and behold, the police turned up there. and they'd had an anonymous call that there was a black mass being celebrated in this house, and a malicious call, and the police rolled up. Even if there had been a black mass going on by that stage, 1956, you would have struggled actually to find what the Witchcraft Act had been repealed in 1951. But it led to questions being asked in the Houses of Parliament about what were the Battersea police doing, raiding the home of a respectable spiritualists. But the police gave up on attending. It was rather like the Enfield case in a sense. When that first broke out, the natural reaction of the household was to call the police.
Yeah.
So that whatever they were, it wasn't the law they were afraid of there. Technically, if it was all hoaxing and so forth, there would have been numerous crimes, including arson, being committed. So there was a range of possibilities there. It's as I say, it's a case which can't be solved easily, I suspect, if at all.
It doesn't sound like it's solvable, right? And nor is it meant to be, because when you begin to entertain the other side, you've got to understand that the normal rules and regulations don't apply. We're measuring it with what we understand rather than what actually is. There's always going to be a limitation.
Yes, I mean, it was the famous quote of M.R. James, the great ghost story writer. We don't understand the rules. No, very true.
That's right. They have their own rules over there. Should I say they're out with the system? Otherwise, in law, right? You've already said it yourself, right? They could only give the right to the woman that was holding the pen because she's in that system. Right? They can't apply that same system to somebody that physically doesn't have a body and can't be seen. So,
well, indeed, yeah. Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. If there is survival outside the body, it's very hard to determine what sort of, whole embodiment and so on. These are all, we move into the realm of philosophy and theology here.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think first of all, it's to be open and measure it with belief as opposed to measure it with suspicion and circumstances and measurement scales that we only do in a human basis. If it's non-human, you can't apply that same principle. So you have to come at it in a different way before you start measuring it.
Indeed, that is the problem of consciousness. Before we even get onto the other side, you can't measure thought with a meter rule.
Yes, that's right. Fascinating, Alan. I am so impressed by this. What about you, Jonathan?
Well, what I'd like to do, I'd like to bring in Lewis, who has had a poltergeist case very, very soon. Hi, Lewis. Thank you for joining us.
Ah, you made it, Lewis.
I did. I don't look the best today.
Oh, you look fabulous at last minute notice, right? Alex, Lewis has been having some issues at home. Lewis, tell us what's been happening.
So I would say it's about 2-3 weeks ago, I woke up, I think it was about 3 o'clock in the morning, and it sounded like somebody had screamed in my ear that I was going to die in so many days, which worked out to be about, I think it was worked out like the 29th of September. And then recently, my sister was saying that she's had somebody shouting at her, calling her name during the days when she's at home on her own. She actually asked me the other night not to leave her in the house on her own because she was that scared. But also we've been experiencing with the radio, for some reason lately, the radio keeps turning up on its own. So it started around the same time as my experience, and it turned up at about 2:30 in the morning. And then it turned up on its own day before yesterday in the afternoon. And then yesterday it done it when my mum was in the house on her own about 12 o'clock.
Wow. What do you think, Alex? Does that sound a bit like poltergeist stuff?
Well, it could be somewhere on the spectrum. One question I'd ask about the radio switching it on is whether you have a lot of electrical or electronic equipment, or if you're anywhere near things like pylons, masts, a taxi firm that's likely to rev up the radio, anything like that. What sort of premises are we talking about, please, Lewis?
It's just a house, really. The radio's in the kitchen as well, so it's not exactly in. There's nothing around us really that should affect it, to my knowledge, anyway. That is.
Yeah, I mean, the other question I'd ask is, well, I mean, this is something you may not want to share at all openly, but question that Maurice Grosse always used to say, that you need to talk to people not just about their experiences, but what else is going on in their lives at the moment. And sometimes it's the case if you're having a difficult situation or a recent bereavement or anything like that, which of course sadly is a lot of people at the moment, that that can be known to trigger odd incidents, to put it least. I mean, I can think of instances, and they typically are, they're anecdotal, but they've happened to me as well, following the deaths of loved ones. Things have happened, which are physical in a sense. Is it them or was it me? Or could it even be something else? So that I think might be something to ask yourself and your sister is, has anything major happened recently in our own personal lives?
I mean, we haven't had too much bad going on lately. I mean, I was speaking to Lara last night and I was explaining to her that the only sort of real stress that I've gone through at the moment is just going through training in work. But other than that, I know that my mother is currently going through a divorce. But my mother has been experiencing a lot more of like robins and white feathers and things, which she experienced before when my grandfather passed away. And she seems to think now it's our grandfather sort of just helping her through it, because they were really close. Like my grandfather was like it was my great grandfather, so her grandfather, but he was more of a father figure to her because her father died just before I was born. So she's not really had much support father-wise, if you'd like, since he's passed away. So she doesn't really speak to anybody. We haven't really got, well, she hasn't got sort of a father figure in her life now that my great grandfather's passed on. So she thinks that now she's going through this divorce, it's him sort of guiding her through that as well and supporting her a little bit. But nothing really major has happened, and none of us have really spoke of our experiences. I sort of kept mine to myself because I was like, I don't know if it was just like a weird nightmare, but then everything has started happening. So I spoke to my mum about it last night before I messaged Lara, and then my mum was telling me everything about what was going on with my sister and what my mum has experienced as well. And that's when I was like, I'm just going to message Lara, because it just got to the point where I was like, I don't know what to do anymore.
Yeah. Well, first thing I think Lara would agree is not to panic. This kind of thing, although it gets called paranormal, if that's what it is in fact actually very normal and common. So it's not unusual to have these kind of experiences. I can think of my own life. I've experienced things I cannot really explain, even a couple of things I didn't really even believe when I witnessed them. But funnily enough, it's not my own experiences that convince me of the reality of it. It's the similarity between these kind of experiences. You could try, I mean, depending on how you feel about it, I think it's the old cliche, I don't know if Lara would agree, it's good to talk, and good to talk about these things, and also perhaps keep a note or a record of what's occurring, because that in a way can be a way of kind of controlling them, I think. Is coming to terms with it. They're very baffling and confusing, and I'm not going to pretend that I know the answers to them. All I would say is be careful of anybody who comes to you with a ready-made solution to say it's this, that, or the other. And be careful not to exaggerate purely normal events. But equally, these things can ultimately be a kind of learning or healing process, I believe, as well. Quite often people who experience or display some psychic sensitivity or gifts it's not all bad news. It's certainly not like any horror film scenario or anything like that. These people can go on to be very creative individuals sometimes. So I wouldn't see it necessarily as a negative thing. It perhaps should be approached as like any other difficult situation in life. It's best approached by trying to keep calm, and thinking about it, and keeping yourself, look after yourself as well. And as well as your mum and your sister. I think that's very important. I don't know how Lara would take it, but that would be my suggestion from what you're saying.
Yeah, no, I totally get it. It's good advice, Alan. Thank you very much for that. I did have that happen to me once, Lewis, and I woke up, I sat bolt upright in bed, right? I could hear voices talking right next to me, and one shouted at me, saying, I heard her say, shall we tell her now or shall we let her find out on her own? That's what I woke up to. So, of course, I'm sat there in bed thinking, I went to check all the kids. It was pitch black at night. And I'm like, what the hell? It was so loud. And then I figured it was they were talking about my aunt who'd been diagnosed with cancer. And it was to do with, they were kind of letting me know because I had to deal with her daughter and to try and kind of like smooth the passage, smooth the way. And I feel that as an intuitive, that you must be an intuitive, right? And you're a creative. I don't know what kind of job that you're actually in. And I know that you said that you were pressed rather than stressed, right? So obviously you're to make that impression and you're learning an awful lot right now. Maybe it's not your true brilliance, this job. It's just a job, if you know what I mean, just to pay the bills, as opposed to what you're actually really good at. But my bet is that you're actually intuitive and that they're trying to connect with you to develop that, right? Yeah. And the fact that you're able to tell your mum she's getting guidance from her dad / grandfather for that. The whole white feather's being left as well. And usually when I hear death, it's actually to do with death, a part of the life and the start of a new chapter, right? Yeah. And so you're in that paradox phase, that interim phase where change is just about to happen. And everything's going to be okay. Because obviously your mum's been worried about this and you're actually worried in case things haven't, because this is, your mum's having to go alone. You're very close to your mum, right? Of course you want to make it better for her. Yeah. You want to make it better. So it's a very powerless place to be, I think, particularly being male. Very powerless. You can't make it better for her, right? And you're now the next closest male to your mum. You know that, don't you?
Yeah, yeah.
Right, so it's over to you. All right, you can do this. Your mum's tougher than she thinks, and I think she's there. What we need to do is maybe do a session sometime and see if we can connect your grandfather. But just remember and focus on your breathing, right? Anxiety increases when the breathing, we start short-circuiting the breathing, and then the energy fluctuates a lot, and it can pull in all sorts of entities at that point. I'll give you a wee message afterwards. Thank you so much for coming in, though, and sharing that with us.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thanks, guys.
All right, Lewis, you take care.
Yeah, take care. Bye. Bye. Bye.
So, Alan, thank you so much for that. That was absolutely fascinating to sort of jump a case onto you like that.
Well, pleasure. I mean, I like Lara's approach because I think what we have to do is widen our thinking and our approach, and most importantly, what tends to get overlooked in a lot of formal psychic research is the human factor. And first and foremost, it's about making people's lives easier if we're going to be involved. That is the real point. And I think it is very important to always remember there's always human beings at the centre of these. And they must be treated with whatever they say. They must be treated with respect and with care.
That's right, Alan. It's a really good point because it's a really real thing to them, right? What they're feeling is real to them, right? Regardless of anybody else's interpretation, and to honour that and respect that as we try and help facilitate the change, right? The change, basically, is a change. Most human beings don't like change at the best of times, so they don't. We've had a great session today, haven't we, Jonathan?
Alan, thank you so much for coming on, and thank you for
my pleasure. I'm sorry if I've talked a bit too much, but
no, not at all.
Listen, I'm still with the part of this spirit post, asking for letters to be posted, right, and then threatening them if they don't. That's incredible. That's going to keep me going for at least a week, Jonathan.
Absolutely. I know that Amanda had a question, quite a complex one, which I'm sure there won't be a short answer about. Well, Alan thinks of the theory that all paranormal activity, including cryptids, UFOs, ghosts, are linked and caused by ultra-terrestrial beings, interdimensional forces. That's probably a program in its own right, probably as an answer. I also think we may have lost Alan. He probably didn't like that question. Alan, are you still there?
I think his connection's gone because we've got a twirly bit.
We got a little twirly bit. So, Alan, if you can hear us, thank you so much. We'll try and contact you afterwards. Thank you for joining us this week.
Forget to check Alan's. Have we got the link in the comments section? Have we, Alan's?
Yes. So I have put the link to his article on the Poltergeist Prince of London, the remarkable true story of Battersea Poltergeist by Shirley Hitchens and James Clark. You can read all about that review and what details of where to get that book that was published in 2013 on the link. I put it out. And also go and have a look at the Ghost Club. If you're interested, remember we are interested in if people could think about joining these organizations and offering their time in terms of link out now about archivists, and people who could spend the time and the legwork basically to research this huge quantity of and stuff. And we got some tapes that we're going to go through, and it's going to take a long time, but it needs this dedicated work.
It is, right? There's a lot of people out there, right? And the Ghost Club has a lot of them, right? As does the Supernatural Society as well, where they've put some lot of time, lot of effort, a lot of diligence, going into it all, right? There's some real evidence and stuff to look into. And I think sometimes that's wasted, isn't it, Jonathan, when it comes to like what Most Haunted were doing and, a lot of other programs and stuff, and maybe comes across as being a bit sensational because, of course, they want to show the exciting part. There's a lot of hard work behind the scenes, isn't there, before it even gets to that stage.
So what we will hope to do with the Supernatural Society and the magazine is that we're going to focus on some of this work that's being done, these cases like the Battersea case, and the Enfield gets all the publicity, gets the film made, but the even longer running cases such as Battersea don't get the publicity. And there's a lot on Facebook Lives at the moment with people chasing demons that chain to trees and all sorts of weirdness. And really, it's about this sort of more thorough research that's going on that really should get a little bit more press coverage.
Yeah, absolutely. So that'll be another thing. We'll be here for at least 3 years or all that.
There's enough material out there, I believe so. So next week, I think we have, hopefully, a very special guest joining us. I'm just looking it up now, actually. We have Andrew Grant, who I hope is going to be joining us, who is a medium.
You need to come and see the best physical mediums that you'll ever have the pleasure of connecting with. Andrew Grant's amazing.
So I shared a house with him, so I know all about him. I know the dirty secrets, so I can dish the dirt on him.
So there's not just secrets, Jonathan, there's dirty secrets, is there? Ooh.
Oh, yeah. So, in fact, there was a very interesting case. I'll tell you very quickly. I'm going to bring it up with him next week. When I was sharing a house with him, I had a copy of the New Scientist magazine appear on my doorstep. Out of the blue, didn't know where it came from. And inside the magazine were certain letters were circled. And the letters on different pages then spelled out the journey continues here or something like that. I can't quite remember. It was about 2 years ago.
Oh my goodness.
No explanation as to where it came from. I still think it was him. He's saying it wasn't him. So it's almost like this poltergeist case we were discussing, where who put this magazine through my door, who circled all the letters. So I've got the magazine somewhere. I'm going to find it and I'm going to confront him with it next week.
Anybody who knows that is he struggles to organise himself, never mind something like that.
That's also very true, yes.
I know, babe. Guys, you need to come back next week and meet Andrew, right? Really excited for you to meet him. And I'm excited to see this magazine, Jonathan. I can't wait now.
I need to find it. I'm sure I kept it. I'm absolutely sure I kept it.
All right, that's great. You're very welcome, Mark Davis. He's saying it was a great session today, guys. I'm so glad that you joined that. Sheena, sorry we missed you for most of it as well. And guys, thank you so much for being on today. We've gone well over today. This is turning
well over. Yes, there's so much to talk about.
An hour and a half, so much to talk about. We're we're extending, aren't we, Jonathan? Quite subconscious.
It'll be a 2-hour show before you know it.
Before you know it, we'll be here for 5 hours trying to get rid of us.
Thank you, guys, and we will see you next week. Be safe and take care.